What's up and welcome back to MoAn Inc. If you're new here, then hello! My name's Erica and it's a pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Because for today's video, as you can see from the title, we are going to be chatting about all things Pliny the Elder today, which is so different for the channel and I'm so excited about it! But before we can get into all of that, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so that you know every single time I post in the future. And now that you've so kindly done that, let's get into the video. Pliny the Elder was born in 23 CE or AD, and he dies in 79 CE or AD. All of the ancient history nerds should have all of their alarm bells ringing at that date. So he was born in Cisalpine Gaul, which is here on a map, even though he is technically a Roman because the Romans had already taken over this particular part of the world. However, he is born in Cisalpine Gaul and then he dies down in the south of Italy in the eruption of Vesuvius at Pompeii. So let's figure out what his life was like, and then I will introduce you to the most famous work that is attached to him, which is, it should really be why we know him, but really we know him for the eruption of Vesuvius, but we'll get to all of that in a second. What we know of Pliny the Elder's life is actually quite interesting. So he is somebody who came from an equestrian family, so we know that he has a great education growing up, and he does end up deciding that he wants a political and military career, and he seems to be pretty good at it. At just 23, he goes to serve in Germany, in Germania, which is just the Latin name for Germany. I don't know why I wanted to explain that to you, you could guess. And he very quickly goes from being just a regular run-of-the-mill soldier to being the commander. He then goes back to Rome and he maybe studies law, we don't really know, but he certainly continues his education in Rome because he is just so promising and because he was so good at the military. However, when Emperor Nero, who's the 5th emperor of Rome, steps in to start ruling and start doing his thing, Pliny the Elder ends up moving to Spain where he lives in semi-retirement for a number of years. He's not really doing all that much. He doesn't want to be in Rome. However, when Vespasian ends up stepping up to be emperor in 69 CE, Pliny is very happy to go back to Rome. Now, the reason for this is because when he was in Germany, he actually served alongside Vespasian. So after all of that, he goes back to Rome to continue his political and military career. It's from Vespasian that he ends up getting all of these different military rankings and important political positions, which ultimately lead him in 79 to go down to Pompeii when the eruption is happening. Now we have lots of stories of Pliny when he gets down to Stabii. One of them, which is probably the most famous, is that when Pliny gets down to these like southern ports, he and his men, because the seas are so choppy, they end up, pulling their boats in, getting out, and when they get into this house, again, bear in mind, Vesuvius is erupting. I'm laughing just because it's so silly where you're like, oh my god, this big thing is happening. To be fair, they didn't know. They did not know that the volcano was erupting. They were just like, wow, it's like a really big cloud and the seas are really not doing it for our boat, so we might as well take a break. But Pliny, for some reason, is like, I need to take a bath in this moment. For some reason you see a cloud and you're like, I should probably be clean before we face that. Which is only funny because of the practicality of it, because then it's not funny because then, as we know, he does die there. So I'm not laughing at that, and that's not funny. It's just the isolated instance of seeing a cloud, seeing the choppy seas even, and deciding that a bath is going to solve at least 50% of your problems. You're like, I can't do anything about that, but I can do something about me, and I smell gross and I look gross, so I'm going to take a bath. He then ends up dying down in Pompeii. And I think that's the most famous thing about him. But I think a lot of people don't realize that there are two Plinies, because so many people know Pliny attached to Pompeii, but don't realize that that is the Pliny who dies at Pompeii, but then he leaves everything to his nephew. And that's because he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have any children. So his legacy basically gets passed on to his sister's child, who ends up becoming Pliny the Younger. And it's through him and his letters that we find out a lot of the details about Pompeii, because even though Pliny the Younger wasn't at Pompeii, he was close enough to see everything and to hear everything, obviously, after his uncle's demise, shall we say. So although Pliny the Elder had an incredible military career and is definitely most famous for his Pompeii moment in the grand scope of history, and it's even been written about in Elodie Harper's The Wolf Den trilogy, a character that I really love that she included because most of her characters are fictional, is the historical figure of Pliny the Elder. And I think that's a really fantastic inclusion of a historical character in historical fiction, and even his bath is mentioned in that series as well. Elodie and I had a whole chat here on the channel about Pliny's bath. Just couldn't resist. But he should be most famous in history as being an author. Pliny wrote so many different works that were dedicated at various points of his life. Unfortunately, most of them do not survive. But the most important one that we still have is his natural history. Now, the natural history is split up into 37 books. 37. And by books, you guys who are regulars know that I do not mean like big boy books, right? I don't mean these kinds of books. I mean chapters. And so there are 37 chapters of the natural history, which basically was his attempt to connect the world around him and to make sense of what was going on, right? Like, he is one of the first people to really do this. He's one of the people to try and make sense and put together all these facts and try and come up with like a cohesive theory about the world around him in a non-religious sense, right? So that's really important, that he was doing it as more so factually based, as scientifically based as we can possibly label it, and that was what the whole project was. Now, this project, before I tell you all the details about it, this was super important for like most of like old history. Obviously, when we actually started, you know, going into science and all that kind of stuff, it was like, well, maybe this is like not right. But up until like the late Middle Ages, people were still referring to Pliny's natural history for their research as their like big encyclopedia of like what plants do what and how the world works, the cosmology, all of that kind of stuff. Up until the late Middle Ages, like just listen to that, they still used this book. So what exactly is in this book? I know that you're probably asking. Obviously, I had to write it down because there was no way I was going to remember 37 books worth of stuff that is then not accurate. So the preface of the natural history is just Pliny explaining who the book is dedicated to, why he's dedicating it to that person, and it's actually dedicated to Titus, who ends up taking up the, I was going to say emperorship. Is that even a word? But either way, he ends up becoming emperor after Vespasian. So he dedicates the book to Titus, explains all of that in the preface. Then book 1 is actually a summary of what the other 36 books will be. It's always made me wonder, like, why would you need to do that? Like, just start writing. It's as if I did like a super long intro in these videos. Everybody's always like, oh my God, the intro is so long. Please make it stop. This man dedicated a whole chapter to explaining what the other chapters were going to be. Brave, but okay. Book 2 is really where things start getting interesting, and that book is dedicated to cosmology and astronomy. Book 3 through 6 is dedicated to physical and historical geography. Book 7 through 19 is all about botany, so that's thrilling. However, it is noteworthy to point out book 18, which is all about agriculture and is especially important for agricultural techniques, such as like crop rotation and farm management and things that actually end up coming later. Obviously, we have refined it, but he is the person who had like this whole description of ox-driven grain harvesting sort of stuff that happened in like Gaul. And that was absolutely mind-boggling. So let's not discredit absolutely everything, because a number of things, I think most of this book was really important for starting that conversation. Book 20 to book 32 focus on medicine and drugs. Oh God, can I say drugs? I've just said it twice. But yeah, medicinal things is what I really should have said. Book 33 up until the end then discusses materials, precious stones, metals, those sorts of things that like craftsmen kind of use, right? So that's what he's discussing. And like I said, the really important thing and the really monumental thing about this text is that Pliny is connecting all of these natural world things and trying to make one cohesive narrative that doesn't rely necessarily on religion. It doesn't rely on mythical magic. It is really trying to sit there and make sense of the things around him, which is why this book was so important. It was not the only book that he wrote that was important. Again, he did so much work, of which doesn't survive to us, and that happens to be the one that survives to us, but still it is a really fundamental and good base for a lot of our history. And something that I always say is that we should always be going back to all of these original writings, even if they're not necessarily, you know, right, or they don't actually add. It's very important to see where it started, that it took that one mind to write this thing that then had it laying the path throughout the centuries. So Pliny the Elder is a fascinating man. He's really, really interesting. And I think it's quite upsetting that we lose a lot of him to time and a lot of him to the fact that he wrote this natural history that people probably are a bit like, ooh. But that doesn't mean he's not noteworthy, and that doesn't mean that I didn't want to give him a moment on the channel. So thank you guys so much for tuning into this video, and I'll be seeing you next time with more videos here on MoAn Inc. I'll see you guys then.